Since it's Martin Luther King Day, I thought it would be a good time to talk about one of my favorite Spark shorts, Smash and Grab, which happened to be released 2 years ago today. Smash and Grab brings up some interesting questions about violence and freedom and how we think about them, so I wanted to spend some time exploring that here. Which is why, even with explosions and all, Smash and Grab has a lot to do with Martin Luther King Jr. And I promise I'll get to that, but first, let's take a look at this amazing short. Smash and Grab is about two robots who are forced to work. They've had enough when they discover their labor is used to make energy sources for robots who get to be free in floating cities above them. Fleeing with two of the energy sources, they are pursued and forced to fight. They manage to get away, but not without injury and losing one of their energy sources. But united, they carry on. The story is inspired by the writer Brian Larson's wish for more freedom at his job.
Like I was doing something over and over again, and I wanted to try something that broke me out of that a little bit.
We can even see the environment the robots work in prioritizes control over being productive. Something I'm sure many of us can relate to, because we too live in a world where little regard is given to workers, and the rewards go to others who don't do the work. I don't think that's all the story is about though. If it was, why choose the title Smash and Grab? Like, sure, it makes sense because it's what the robots do, but they could have easily written the story with robots having almost any job, right? Merriam-Webster defines smash and grab as describing a robbery that is done by breaking a window of a car, store, etc., and stealing whatever can be taken quickly. That does describe what happens in the story, but the robots are also the heroes, right? I mean, they were treated awful and risked it all for freedom. I guess this got me thinking about how the media portrays things and that it has a large impact on whether or not we decide violence is justified. For example, in my last video, I talked about how these portrayals in media can help justify violence towards disabled people. There's even this comment on the Smash and Grab YouTube video.
News at 9. Two disgruntled robots turn to class warfare and carry out a terrorist attack on rail infrastructure, causing collapse of grade-separated railway and disrupting vital fuel supply lines for tens of millions of city-dwelling robots.
If you lived in the city up above, how would the news be portrayed to you? This feels especially relevant with the protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder. A significant number of people thought that most of the protesters were trying to incite violence or destroy property, despite there even being a study done looking at the protests between May 26th and August 22nd of the year that shall not be named, showing that less than 7% had been violent. And 38 of less than those 220 violent incidents were instances in which demonstrators had significantly damaged or torn down memorials. I guess you could debate whether a property equates violence when it is a small business or something, but a memorial where no one is being harmed? But a more interesting question is, if we consider these things violent, it still begs the question, is violence always bad? Like, obviously no one likes violence. People have been quick to make sure to condemn any violence that could be related to Black Lives Matter. Several polls have shown that a large majority of people think violence isn't a proper response to the death of George Floyd, even though a majority also think the police are more likely to use excessive force against Black people. And this brings me back to the title, Smash and Grab. It sounds a lot like rioting and looting, doesn't it? Or burning and looting. So why is it our protests in the real world that are in response to police brutality are painted negatively, with a focus on accusing protesters of destroying and taking? Yet, in an animation where our heroes are literally causing destruction and fighting cops, no one's thinking, oh no, look at all the destruction they've caused. Why do we feel less discomfort and hesitation in a story about fictitious characters? Why is there more empathy and understanding? I mean, this is the United States. Aren't we all about freedom? Are people free when they can be killed by state-sanctioned violence at any time? And the cops that carry it out often do so with impunity? How is a community supposed to respond to a murder like Breonna Taylor's? And now is the obligatory time for a white person to bring up what MLK Jr. would say. Only, I'm not going to tell you what he'd think or say because we can't know. But let's talk about the memory of Dr. King. Often we see his memory weaponized. He was against violence, they'll say. But forget at the time, protests he was involved with were often not viewed as peaceful. Sounds a lot like the public perception of some other protests, doesn't it? And how accurate is our memory of King? We hear about his I Have a Dream speech, which was in 1963, but not much else afterwards, even though he was still fighting for change almost 5 more years before his assassination in 1968. He knew there was more to do after the victories of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, because those laws did nothing to provide jobs or housing, which disproportionately affected Black people, which is why he supported the Poor People's Campaign. He stood against the Vietnam War, pointing out that economic decisions and the pursuit of war directly hurt communities here. As he wrote in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? The bombs in Vietnam explode at home. They destroy the hopes and possibilities for a decent America. All of that being said, I guess watching Smash and Grab, I'm reminded how easy it is to ignore all the violence that's indirect or done farther from home. And it's easy to villainize someone who picks up a brick or smashes a window, and the media plays a large part in that. I guess I just think that violence is often a lot more complicated than we make it out to be, and that we often seem far more critical of those with the least power and not critical enough of those with lots. Before I go, I just want to bring up one last quote by Dr. King that stood out to me with Smash and Grab. Someone must have sense enough and morality enough to cut off the chain of hate and evil. And this can only be done through love. Sure, these robots were violent, but their motivation was love. The violence didn't come from a place of hate. It was from a sense of wanting to protect, to prevent more harm from being done. And I think that's what makes them heroes. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed another look at a Spark Short and you're doing well. If you want to support this content or join a community interested in supporting others like this, please check out our new Patreon page. I'll get a video up explaining the goal separately at some point because we're trying to do things a little differently. Thanks again for all your support.